Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today at Engineers Without Borders UK for the first in a series of virtual panel discussions that we'll be facilitating to discuss and learn about some of the pressing matters within the engineering sector today. We hope to use these opportunities to inspire, enable, and influence the engineering community, but also to provide you with some actions you can take away and put into practice within your own working life. Just so you know, we are recording this session and may use this video publicly, for example, on our own Engineers Without Borders UK website. So, my name is Katie Cresswell-Maynard. I'm the Chief Executive of Engineers Without Borders UK, and I'm delighted to be joined by three people who are going to help us explore our discussion topic today from different perspectives and from different locations around the world. So for the next hour, we will be exploring the role of community in the design process across big and small engineering projects. We will be asking questions like, how has community consultation evolved and where could it be improved? How do you balance the range of interests, intents and purposes? And at what stage does community consultation take place in an ideal world, from a corporate perspective and from a community perspective? We will also be fielding questions from you at home. We want this to be as interactive as possible and for you to be involved in the discussion. So please do send your questions in through the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and we will do our best to address them. So why this topic? We chose this discussion topic because it really does speak to the heart of the principles we live by when we talk about globally responsible engineering, that the engineering process should be inclusive in recognition of the fact that engineering impacts on people's lives and livelihoods every single day. This week is also special for us because we are celebrating the grand finals of our Engineering for People Design Challenge programme here in the UK. Since launching the programme 9 years ago, tens of thousands of young engineering students have been encouraged to explore and embed the ethical, environmental, social and cultural aspects of a real-world context into their engineering design. In doing so, starting their journey to becoming globally responsible engineers who can better ensure that engineering really does serve all people and the planet better than ever before. We're proud that this year we've had students from across the UK, Ireland, South Africa and the US take part. And this coming Friday, we will find out which student teams from the UK and Ireland will be crowned the winners of this year's national competition. So please make sure you join us for the results. And you'll be receiving an email after this session with sign-up instructions if you're interested in joining us. So, back to the task in hand and to introduce you to our fantastic panellists. This year, the brief we gave students for the Engineering for People Design Challenge focused on an urban area of Johannesburg in South Africa, known as Makers Valley. So our first panellist joins us all the way from Johannesburg. I'd like to introduce Sizwe Mayson. Give us a wave, Simon. There he is. Who works at enabling a well-being economy in Makers Valley by reducing inequalities and increasing sustainability through partnership building, mixed income developments, and early childhood development. Our second panellist is Jenny Irvine, who's joining us from somewhere in the wilds of Scotland. Give us a wave, Jenny.
Hi.
So Jenny has worked in civil engineering for more than 20 years, mostly within heavy civils projects. This has included projects on roads and transportation schemes, landfills, and wind farms. And for the last 3.5 years, Jenny has worked as a project manager for Scottish Water on the preparation and delivery phases of new and refurbished water and wastewater treatment works. And finally, we're joined by Franklin Kirimi. Give us a wave, Franklin. There he is, who works at the Konkuey Design Initiative in Nairobi, Kenya, as a design coordinator. Franklin has extensive experience in community-led design and the conception, development, and implementation of low-cost, high-impact design interventions, with a particular focus on different scales of urban design and sustainable drainage strategy. So welcome to you all, and thank you for being part of our first panel. It's amazing that, you know, we've got 3 panelists from 3 different countries, possibly 3 different time zones as well. We're really excited to have you be a part of this. So what I'd like to do is start by inviting each member of our panel to say a few introductory words and to give us your perspective on the community engagement process. So my first question, with your introductory words, is how have communities been engaged in the types of projects you've been involved with over your career to date? So Franklin, perhaps you can start us off.
Yeah. Hi everyone, good afternoon here in Nairobi. My name is Franklin Kirimi, as Katie has mentioned, and thank you for this opportunity. My background is in landscape architecture, and I have worked in Kibera here in Nairobi, which is sort of one of the Nairobi's largest informal settlements, for nearly 6 years. And in this period, I've built extensive experience in community participation, which is basically coupling local knowledge and technical expertise to achieve sustainable infrastructure solutions. I have learned that that co-designing is in such a context, and I'll try and shape the context in a few. It goes beyond involving people in just construction of amenities, and it requires you to build broken trust and encouraging confidence of participants to give critical input and feedback. To just shape an idea is when you walk into Kibera as an outsider and looking to engage with the community and bring a bit transformation, it is in a context where residents have had past experience of undelivered infrastructure or broken trust by either government or non-government agencies. So in that case, you have a sort of a lower point to start from, and you have to build this. And so part of, at the core of what KDI does is that community participation. And we look to leverage these community networks and capacities to establish the relationships with organized groups. And we've realized that there's already good networks and good fabric that is already established in Kibera. So through our 11 projects in 10 years, I'll give a sort of brief process of how we engage in communities and how they have been engaged. So we begin by requesting for proposals, which are submitted by organized groups living in informal settlements. And the proposals contains the challenges and the desires desired solutions by the applying groups. We then formalize this partnership with the groups and organize several workshops, inviting all interested residents from the neighborhood into an open conversation. Then this helps validate the challenges and even the solutions that were highlighted in the request for proposal. We continue to hold these workshops from before construction, during construction, and after construction. And then sort of through this partnership, we start to create awareness in organizational structures within the community. We provide formal and informal training in construction and maintenance, and also financial management skills. Through implementation, we also bring in community participation through labor, material, and even monetary contribution, and that helps build their sense of ownership. We equip them with operation and maintenance skills for the constructed infrastructure. Going beyond construction, we also do evaluation, and we've benefited a lot from the trust we've built with the communities to conduct household surveys, enroll residents in data collection, and also getting genuine feedback from the communities. And I think in that sense, we as being a design and build organization, we've been able to involve community participation right from the start through the end and helped operationalize the projects.
Okay, great. Thank you, Franklin. And I think the point you made there about trust is really, really important, really interesting. And I think I'd like to come back to that. But before doing that, I'd like to spin the wheel and move round to Jenny. So Jenny, I'm sure, or I imagine it might be a slightly different picture when working in water and wastewater treatment works across Scotland. Can you give us a bit of insight from your experience?
Hi, sure, I'd love to. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so we work with Scottish Water right through the life cycle of each of these projects. So just to kind of explain a bit what that looks like, we would be handed the project at CapEx 1 with a scope to deliver, and we spend typically around 12 months really getting to grips with that scope, understanding what it is the client needs. And it's at this point that we need to look at the project, look at its location, look at the local landowners that could be affected, not only by the construction operation, but also by the life cycle of this project. So say this plant's going to be there for 40 or 50 years. What does that mean for the local residents? In many cases, we need to buy land to actually construct the new plant. And we also need to get planning permission from the local authority to go ahead and build. So by virtue of that alone, there is a lot of local engagement with the community, with the residents, with the neighbours. So that's kind of step one. We would identify these people, we would reach out to them via letter, or even setting up stalls in local supermarkets, particularly if we've got new water treatment works. People are usually quite excited about that. It's a good thing for the local community. So we would set up a stall, we would talk to people about the proposals, how long construction is going to take, the investment value, the benefit, and just let people have access to all of this information right at the start. If there are landowners we need to buy land from, that's obviously it's a private conversation that's taken offline. But again, having their buy-in to the process right at the start really helps us to proceed and progress. And we have to, because this is taxpayers' money, we have to have these things, these agreements in place before we proceed to construction. So it's a really critical part of the process. Once we get the green light to proceed with construction, we will then reach out again just to update the local residents, landowners, stakeholders, and say, okay guys, that's us ready to go. We've got a project locally to here actually where we've got works that we're having to utilise a bit of footpath that was used, very popular with dog walkers and joggers, etc. So it's making sure people know in advance that there's going to be a little bit of disruption, that we'll do everything we can to minimise it. And in my experience, as long as that information is out there early, we tend to not have anything with regards to backlash. People are quite happy. They understand what's going on. They understand why. They understand the benefit. And for me, that's a really kind of key point in community engagement is taking everyone with you, letting them have access to any information they have, any concerns they have. The letters that go out have my phone number on them, so anybody can contact me anytime to pick my brains about the project and can alleviate any concerns they may have.
Great, thank you, Jenny. So yeah, potentially quite a different kind of operating environment to the type of one that Frank was talking about. So last but not least, I'd like to ask Simon to bring in his perspective and how things have worked for him in his work in Johannesburg. Thanks.
Yeah, so I've been involved in different ways in participation over the years. And I think, interestingly, I don't come from an engineering background at all. I come from more of an anthropology background, and in anthropology you have something called participant observation, which is where typically it was where very colonial style research was done amongst native populations, where you went to go live with the natives, and that's been upgraded or advanced a little bit more in these times, but the essence of it is really understanding how people are living currently before any intervention happens or before any project is carried out, and what the experiences of people are through kind of living it as somebody would live it. And that kind of understanding of participation is an interesting one that maybe we can talk about a little bit more. So since my master's, when I did, it was an urban planning master's, but I used a lot of participant observation. I worked with UN Habitat briefly in Nairobi, actually, same where Frank is right now. And there I was very frustrated by the lack of participation that was being drawn into policy documents that were going to be applicable globally. I then moved to Joburg and was working with the city of Joburg. And their participation often went seriously awry. I mean, we had a riot on our hands at one point because of a kind of town hall meeting where people were just incredibly frustrated by the fact that they were only being brought in right at the end of the discussion that was going to essentially result in a policy document that was about eviction. So a very tense situation in Joburg. And then other work around kind of policy, where a lot of it was more around kind of interview format participation and focus groups. And then now we're playing with really interesting types in Makers Valley, which is where EWB has been involved for the last year and a half. And with Makers Valley, what we're trying to do is participation through jointly working on projects together. So it's around drawing people in from a variety of different backgrounds to work on the same project together. And in that way, enabling people to kind of converse and discuss and really get to know each other, rather than kind of having a participation event and then the project or a participation sort of survey. But we also are using, I mean, we're doing a massive census at the moment around people's response to the food crisis because of COVID-19. And that's what we're really trying to get a sense of each household circumstances. So we're using a kind of standard, you know, literally a Google form asking a set of questions, etc.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simon. So just briefly before we move on to the next questions, Franklin, I have a clarification question for you. So someone's asked if you could just clarify that you, in what you said, that you involve communities before you've even won the work. So as part of producing the proposal, I think you said that you received scopes from members of the community themselves. Is that correct? Just clarifying that point. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, it does. It actually forms part of the selection of the group that wins the project. And so the engagement is Kibera-wide, and our community team, which is an in-house team of experts in community engagement, help a lot with spreading and sharing this request for proposal with everyone in Kibera. So yes, we allow as many people, as many groups to apply, but then the selection is oriented on it's all aligned with the requirements of the project that we are implementing.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Hopefully the person that asked that question is satisfied with the answer. So I think this is a really interesting topic in terms of at what stage you get at what stage communities become involved in the process. And Simon, I know you touched on it there about this idea of participation and moving beyond consultation. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that and maybe some of the practicalities associated with managing different interests and intents and purposes in that process. Is that something that you could provide us with a bit more insight into?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, I mean, originally, a lot of projects from engineering to international development projects or whatever, and I've worked more with the international development space in Southern Africa, and there often what was the experts, which were mostly white, often male, so-called experts from the global north would come and say, you know, this is what needs to be done, and then they would do it to the community or do it to the neighborhood, and then they would probably leave it. And quite often what would happen in that circumstance is that as soon as they would go back home, or kind of the funding would stop for the maintenance of whatever they'd installed, it would all fall apart. And often I've seen, water infrastructure that's been installed where it kind of rendered obsolete within a few years even. It's, after a massive capital investment, because there wasn't any understanding of how people are doing things currently and how any intervention could be working with the existing dynamics of that specific group of people or community or organization or whatever. And so then there was a realization in international development and that consultation needs to happen. And so there was a lot more input from people that were staying there, but that input was mostly done in the form of, for instance, a town hall style meeting or perhaps a couple of focus groups, and often quite far along in the stage of development or design. And it was more around like, the approaches are sort of like, okay, we want to do this. What do you think of this? Rather than what it is that we should be doing. You know, maybe there isn't an actual issue with the water infrastructure in the first place. Maybe the current system is actually working for people. And quite often in that process, there still wasn't a very good track record with the sustainability of the project after it had been implemented. And so now, really, people are speaking to participation rather than just consultation. The difference is maybe a play in words, but the participation means that people are involved, right, and are participating in the project, so in the whole design process, and preferably right from the start. And I mean, obviously, it's not always possible to do that, but quite often we quickly overlook the possibilities because of the ways of doing, you know, business as usual. And quite often it is actually possible to have even if it's a site visit with a couple of interviews right from the start to really, before the design even gets off the ground, but preferably to have people that are very familiar with how things work on the ground on the team, so on the design team, on the development team, because that's much more likely to result in something that will last beyond a few years after it's been finished. And I think that people are still struggling with this. I mean, the Johannesburg Development Agency is very much ahead of its time in much of the co-creation. I mean, there's a kind of concept of co-creation now, or co-production. And the Johannesburg Development Agency has really embraced that, and Makers Valley actually came about as a result of something called Our City, Our Block, which is, you can hear by the name, it's really speaking to participation from the beginning and trying to enable that participation for people to take responsibility for their areas. But even they struggle because of things like procurement policies, because of how things need to be bought in the municipality and how contracts can be awarded. They cannot be awarded to small scale community groups if they don't have all of the right certificates in place, etc. And that's the case with a lot of projects, a lot of engineering projects, where even if you have the participation, sometimes it's difficult to actually realize it in a tangible way that people really have a say over things and can carry out. For instance, if they're capable of carrying out the work, some of the work themselves, the procurement issues are often the things that limit real participation in the project.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously quite an interesting balance and tension there between, you know, when you said about who can be awarded a contract or not, you know, I guess the theory behind why some of those policies might be in place from an ideal perspective might be because that's about quality assurance and ensuring that, you know, it's competent contractors and companies delivering on those projects. But perhaps, you know, as you say, there's always opportunity to review those things and ask whether they are fit for purpose, and whether there are opportunities being missed for other actors to engage in the process. Thank you, Simon. Just one question on that. I think someone is sort of asking around, you know, how you perhaps engage a community in those preliminary stages. So the question is it bad practice to approach a survey with a predetermined project? How would you?
So in an ideal world, I mean, look, so often it's that if you're talking in a development context, sometimes the difficulty is that donors are still very old school in the way that they award funding. They've got a set of KPIs. They need to speak to those KPIs with whatever project comes about. So sometimes there's a bit of flexibility, but quite often not so much. And so therefore you have a kind of predefined project, and therefore the survey has to speak to that. But I think that there is a lot of pressure from the development community not to have that approach to the same degree. And you still are able to be very, if you familiarize yourself with what the specs are for, I mean, what the KPIs are, that you can still be quite flexible within that. I think that it's different with, I mean, I'm sure Jenny's got a lot to say. It's not a development context about this, it's different, but I think that quite often, if you come with a specific set of questions for a specific project, you're going to get a specific set of answers for that as well. And I think I saw briefly, and I didn't look at it in depth, but there was another question around that's called interview bias, you know, and quite often it's a confirmation bias, where you'll come in with, and the way that you ask a question, you're going to get a certain response, or people will respond because the engineer or the developer or whatever holds the most power in this relationship. And if people seek, often if we're working in less resourced areas, even if it's in Scotland, for instance, you know, people are really desperate to gain from the project in a way that will boost their own pocket sometimes because they're desperate, or that boost the neighborhood in the way that they see as best. But the issues that they'll often give responses that are then just what you want to hear in order to kind of get a working relationship going with you. So it's very good to kind of have a much more open approach to speaking to as wide a variety as possible. And sometimes, I mean, I found it very useful to not link, in the beginning stages, not link the kind of prospect of massive development with the research as much as possible. So not to be kind of hiding the real intentions of the project, but to really try and leave it as open as possible, rather than saying, you know, we wanting to do a massive water project in this neighborhood that's going to produce a lot of jobs. And what about these questions? You know?
Yeah, interesting. So managing, you know, trying to manage expectations at the same time as trying not to influence, you know, the information that people might be willing to share with you. Thank you, Simon. So yeah, I'd like to kind of come to Jenny, because you know, I'm imagining a number of our audience are probably from the UK, given you know, that's where a large number of our current subscribers are from. And I'm imagining a few people will probably be sitting there thinking, oh, but it's quite different in the UK. You know, we have a different set of expectations around how people are involved in engineering infrastructure. And, you know, sometimes we perceive a distinction, as Simon touched on then, between developing and developed countries, which I think he was right to highlight is perhaps in this instance, you know, completely irrelevant. You know, this is about how do we improve engineering infrastructure and kind of engage people in that process so that the output and the outcome is better as a result. So interested from your perspective, Jenny, about, you know, and the types of projects you're involved with as well. I would imagine sometimes the sorts of things that we imagine to be out of sight, out of mind. So where our water is treated, or where our wonderful sewage is treated, for instance. So interested to know from you, you know, how that level of expectation around community involvement, is it hard? Is it difficult to get people, you know, to kind of engage in that process in the UK? And then also, I think we had a question on, you know, how do you bring the rest of the project team with you, so other contractors or suppliers that maybe a bit less willing to engage in this community engagement process? Yeah,
so I think projects that I'm working on at the moment in Scotland, we're quite fortunate in that generally a new water treatment works and sewage treatment works are to the betterment of the local community. So we don't, ostensibly at least, receive too much negative, not ordinarily too much negative feedback from the local community. People understand that this will facilitate growth in the area, and that oftentimes actually is to catch up with historic growth that has taken place. So There's a project I'm working on at the moment where we are increasing the capacity of a reservoir, and some of the local concern was, well, please tell me that doesn't mean that there's going to be a whole load of new houses built nearby. And actually it doesn't. The area is a kind of greenbelt area. There's no planning permission in place for any new development whatsoever. But what Scottish Water do need is capacity in their works. So they need to know that given all the new houses that have been built in the last 10, 20, 30 years since the initial reservoir was constructed, that there's capacity in the network to continue to have a bit of headroom. So I think people understand that, and you know, I think I have worked, for example, in Australia on the coal seam gas infrastructure, which was far more contentious, far more local opposition. There had been quite a number of documentaries there that were very inflammatory and as is still going on now with regards to fracking and extraction of coal seam gas around the world. So understandably, you're going to get much more heated debate locally with local residents. People really were quite strongly against it. I wasn't involved in any of the upfront consultation on that. I was strictly involved in the construction element. So I was, and the rest of the construction team, quite shielded from that. And I know, but there was a lot of negotiation leading up to us starting on site with local residents, and in some cases, massive, you know, acres and acres and acres of land were purchased, and people were just bought out effectively to allow these works to go ahead. So it's interesting. It's very much about economic drivers, and on projects like that, you know, money was not an object, whatever it took to get the project through. Whereas, in contrast, you know, Scottish Water, public utility company, it's public money, so that is never going to be the case, which is another reason that the community engagement process is handled well, and that people really understand the benefit to the local community of what we're trying to do. So yeah, it's interesting. Locale and type of project, so you know, so different, and really affects what community engagement is all about. And as Simon was saying, whether or not people are going to gain from it, whereas in Scotland with water projects, it really just is, you're going to have better infrastructure. That's all we can ever offer you, and we will do everything in our power to minimise any disruption to you while we deliver that. But that's really the only place you can go with it. Is, you know, it's just interesting to see the contrast.
And in the types of projects you've been involved with, have you found that that community engagement process has perhaps changed the shape of a project or the strategy, like the procurement strategy, for instance, you know, throughout the process, or is it generally tended to be more bringing community alongside with the journey? Sort of interested in that side of it.
Yeah, so I think, again, in this context of Scottish Water and public money, there is limited scope really to change the project or the scope of the project, what we're trying to deliver. What we can change is how we deliver it. So if there was, for example, strong local opposition to us saying we're going to work from 7 AM to 7 PM at night, you know, if that was going to cause too much of an issue and start to affect Scottish Water's reputation, then, you know, that is a real issue. That's a real concern. You know, we just can't have that. You know, it has to be handled that the majority are bought into the process. So yeah, so absolutely, it's much more a case of keeping people informed ahead of the curve, so that they know before any machines arrive on site, and, you know, troops of plant, you know, being wheeled up to an access track, they'll know at least a year in advance that there will be works going on in the local area. They will have been consulted, their concerns will have been acknowledged, taken on board. You know, if need be, measures will be put in place to alleviate those concerns. So, and a lot of, as much as it's rural, it's relative. So there's still, you know, villages, towns around these works where people are concerned about noise, vibration, any kind of disruption to their water supply as well, of course. So it is about just keeping people informed, and as things progress as well. So even, you know, updates in the local paper to say whenever the plant is commissioned that that's everything now in service, and thanking the community for bearing with us while we got through it. And even things like signage on the traffic management to say, you know, this is for Scottish Water, we are here improving your infrastructure, so that it's, and it is, you know, there's nothing to hide there. It is all positive development to improve infrastructure. So it's, as far as community engagement goes, it's quite an easy one, because it's not contentious the way other projects could be.
And I'm going to ask you a question here that might put you on the spot a little bit. So there's a bit of support here from someone in our audience, Eleanor. So says, you know, procurement and project processes in the UK definitely constrain our ability to engage communities as early as possible. And I think, Simon, you touched on that's, you know, the case in Johannesburg as well. And perhaps, you know, it does feel like quite challenging and perhaps impossible to get communities on board before a project is awarded. But Jenny, I just kind of like to put you a little bit on the spot here and say, you know, the types of things that perhaps Frank and Simon have mentioned in how they approach community engagement in the types of projects they're involved with. Do you think there's space for, you know, UK processes to benefit from perhaps a bit more early involvement and engagement with communities at all?
Potentially. I think it's a fine line, though. I mean, we're not working under a competitive tender. This is a framework agreement where we are looking to maximise efficiencies across the piece. What we do have going for us is that we have sight of a larger programme of work. So potentially you could be looking for efficiencies with procurement, you know, instead of looking at one project in isolation, you could be looking at a dozen projects. You could be looking at an entire region. You could be looking at aligning how you do things for that entire region, or even for the entire country. But it's, again, because it's, you know, there are framework agreements in place with the supply chain, so there's not a vast amount of flexibility. So for me, it would come back to early engagement and making sure people are bought into what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. So I'd like to bring in Franklin here. So Franklin, I know, well, I think it's really interesting. So KDI, who you work for, my understanding is that you implement a similar approach in Nairobi, in Kenya, to the one that you implement in LA and Coachella in California, in terms of engaging community in the engineering process. But I'm imagining that there might be some differences there as well, due to different operating environments that, you know, maybe similar, maybe different to the types of ones that Simon and Jenny have touched on there. Perhaps you could share your insight into that a bit with us, because I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think to speak to our Kenyan context, the kind of the formal setting we work in has very few frameworks around them. One, because there's not really like a planning sort of guidance on how, you know, design and construction would happen in an informal settlement, for example. And then, you know, there's no like land ownership set for people living in Kibera, and they're all basically, you know, it's still government land. And even in terms of construction in that area, it's still in terms of planning and approvals by the county government, it's still a gray area. And you compare that from, I think, in the US, where we're working in Coachella Valley, and even though they are quite similar conditions, I think the legal framework there is different, and the planning guidelines are also different and also quite elaborate. But we've seen some similarity in terms of finding ways to do community engagement and, you know, like maximizing on when people are available, because I think there's a difference, as Simon mentioned, there's a difference between the participation and consultation. So we're looking to find people when they are available. And I think so, like our participants in Coachella Valley are working in the fields, and you have to look for them from the different areas, from the different places they are. And, you know, sometimes we've had to develop like a mobile information hub to get people to come and give their views on their way home from work. We've had to sometimes hold meetings in the hall at, like from 6 to 8 p.m. in the evening once people have come from work. And there's a similar perspective in Nairobi where, we do our meetings over the weekend. We ask people, when are you available? We have Sunday evenings or Saturday afternoons when people are available. And so I think those are the similarities and the differences that we are from both offices.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Frank. And I think, something that a number of different people have sent questions in about, maybe worded slightly differently, but if I can rephrase. So we've definitely had a question on this from Peter, from Mugera, and I think maybe someone else, Joe here, about this, given that, as you mentioned, there may be structural constraints in terms of how we engage communities in a process, but there's also the practical constraints of, well, who's available, when are they available, and how interested are they in engaging in the process. And the question that seems to be coming through is how do we make sure in this process that it's not just the louder voices that are heard, or making sure that this process isn't reappropriated by perhaps local pressure groups or the government, for instance, who want to promote their own agenda, which may not be in alignment with what you're trying to achieve through the engagement process and the project you're trying to put forward. So interested to know from all of you, but I'll start with Frank. How do you create that balance in the process to ensure that all voices that need to be heard are heard, and feel engaged and valued in the process? So Frank, what were your thoughts on that?
Right. This is actually, it's been a big challenge, and sometimes it's different from the different projects we go to. And some of them are dynamics we don't even foresee. So some could be either tribal related or family related. And I'll start with what we've always done ahead of the meetings, which is sort of stakeholder mapping or stakeholder analysis. Wanting to know, which are the voices that will come in and who are people that we want to hear from. And mostly, apart from just doing, desk stakeholder mapping, we have really open workshops, which in Swahili they call them here barazas. It's basically an open workshop inviting anybody to, air their voices. And we have, structure owners coming in with their interests. We have local authority coming in with their interest. You have even individuals coming in with their interests. So there's that aspect of, mapping the different stakeholders, and we a lot concentrate with the primary level of stakeholders, which are, structure owners, women, men, children. Most recently, we've even seen youths who we thought would be too outspoken actually sometimes feel like they cannot speak, in a crowd where there are more elderly people. So we've also seen youths being a different category, and children being also a different, distinct category that we need to address. And so we sort of organize our workshops in a way that, sometimes we'll do subgroups, have women and children separately, or in a school setting, you'd have like the school management in a different discussion, or pupils and teachers on a different group to air their views. And sometimes you want to do either those certain, as I've mentioned, homogeneous groups, or you want to mix them up as well. We have like elders in the community, wanting to speak first, but also speak last. And we've had a cultural dynamic where women or children will not speak after a certain person has spoken. And so, we try and separate these groups to make sure we can get their views in. We also have the dynamic of, like people who are educated or literate against people who are illiterate. So, like people can write, others cannot write. Sometimes that sort of affects their views. So, because you don't want to give, sort of like a sticky note and ask people to write on them, because then it means you lose out on certain views. Some people also shy off from, giving their views as well. And that's why we've also tried doing voting. So sort of like a secret ballot sort of voting where people give their individual feedback. And I think a lot of these have come with their challenges. And I think after every workshop, we try and assess the outcome and want to see, what influenced certain outcome. Is it because the village elder spoke first, or is it because the headmaster cast their vote first, and now they've had to influence everyone else to go in that direction?
Thanks, Frank. Sorry, I'm just aware of time, and I'd like Jenny and Simon to also just add their thoughts to this. Getting the sense that there's a lot that you do, but the primary message I'm getting is really, really taking seriously your role as facilitators of the process and making sure that you are acutely aware of the different stakeholder groups, the dynamics between those stakeholder groups, and really thinking about how the process does and doesn't help or hinder people to engage in the process. Would that be a fair summary of what you've been saying?
That's right, Katie. Yes.
Great. Thanks. So Simon, how would you answer this question? How do you try to ensure that all voices are heard and it's not dominated by loud voices in the room?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I've actually written a piece some years ago on the underbelly of active citizenship, or the underbelly of essentially community participation. And quite often what happens is that people use we mustn't pretend that whether you're working in Scotland or in Lesotho, that people are not trying to manipulate a process for their own good, right? And we must not expect it to be otherwise. So I think that being very clear about human nature in general, and understanding that whatever resources become available, people are often going to be hoping, especially if they're in resource constrained or constrained circumstances, to gain as much resources for themselves. And so I've had a lot of experience, for instance, with different political parties even getting involved in a ward level, which is kind of a local council. I don't know what you call it in the UK actually, borough, I guess, level. And trying to outcompete each other and use the association with a project to gain their own political sway over the residents in the neighborhood. And I think just the first thing is just being aware of it and just really trying to understand the dynamics at a local level of who holds power and who's going to use that power to manipulate things a little bit. And I was responding to someone on the chat, the real way to do that is just through immersion, spending more time in the neighborhood or in the area. And often the resources are not available. So then identifying critical friends within the neighborhood, and I think, or the area. And I think that that's very useful, to identify critical friends that perhaps are not they're not leaders right now, right? So they're not kind of, often the mistake that we have is that we go in and we say, okay, who are the community leaders? But quite often you're going to get more accurate information from just somebody on the street that you can build a bit of a relationship with, that's not a leader, that doesn't hold immense power, but kind of knows what the dynamics are in a specific neighborhood. And then you just, if you have a few more people like that, I mean, I heard Frank speaking to it, making sure you have a diversity of people that you are consulting or that you're drawing into the project. And then the more, there's this lovely analogy of, okay, very quickly, a group of 5 blind men are brought an elephant, and they are asked to get a sense of and to describe this elephant. I think, no, what was it? Oh, and then the elephant leaves. They get a sense of. Then the elephant leaves, and they spend the rest of their days fighting over this, what an elephant is, because the one at the back said, an elephant is long and kind of stringy with tufts of hair. The one on the side said, oh no, an elephant is flat and broad and whatever. And the point being is that, you know, the more input that you get of a diversity of kinds, the more accurate and understanding of the area is, and of the dynamics at play. And I think that helps to reduce the bias and perhaps even issues that get created from only saying somebody, because somebody's going to be like, oh, I'm the community leader. There's often no the community leader. Quite often there's a multiple set of different people holding power in an area.
Great, thanks, Simon. I like the elephant story as well. It's quite visual. And we definitely know elephants aren't skinny.
This is true. I told it terribly. It's actually from about 2,000 years ago in Buddhist texts, but it's been used. So sorry, but I didn't do it justice.
I got it. I understood the gist. I could see it in my mind's eye. So thank you for sharing that. And finally, Jenny. So how does this play out in the context that you're working in? How do you avoid kind of the loud voices dominating the room and dominating the voice that you overall hear as part of the project?
So I think it's really interesting listening to Simon and Frank's takes on it, because I was just thinking, yeah, introverts and extroverts, but there's such a vast array of voices at play here, and different, demographics and social interaction, cultural aspects. It's massive. But so I think the key thing is access. So town hall meeting, fantastic for the loud voices. We all know this. But I find there's actually nothing like a good old-fashioned letter. You can write to somebody, tell them what you're going to do, put your email address, your phone number at the bottom of that letter. And so if that quieter voice doesn't want to get into a room and be part of a Rami or get super vocal about it, but they just have concerns or they have questions, they can very discreetly pick up the phone and have a conversation. And then there's a kind of more casual approach, like having stalls up in easily accessible places within the local community. And I think that's really good as well, because that is giving you that kind of 360 feedback from all people, from all parts of the community, to come and ask questions or say, well, did you know this about that access road, or did you know there was a long-term issue there, or do you know that the client there may have been a dispute, or anything at all. You get really great feedback to these stations. So I think having a multitude of access points to the project team, really, it doesn't matter where you are or where you see yourself in the community, whether it's, if you're a community council leader or you have no active participation in the community at all, apart from the fact you live in it, you still have a say, you still have a voice, you are still acknowledged as part of the project, and you still have a bit of ownership. So I think that's probably much more simplistic, but probably
I think there's a nice message that I think we can draw out of that. That is, if you genuinely want and need, we all hopefully recognise the benefit of having diverse voices. Using Simon's elephant story, the power that diverse voices and insight can bring to what we're trying to achieve into engineering projects. Then you have to take a diverse approach in terms of how you then expect to engage people, because everyone will want to engage differently or be comfortable engaging in a different way. So yeah, if I can just cheekily pull out that key message from what you said there, Jenny, I think that's really strong, really powerful. So we've not got very much time left. I'd cheekily like to squeeze in one last question before we wrap up, but I need to ask you to try and keep your answers short and sweet, if that's okay. I'm getting a 5-minute warning from my colleagues here. My last question is hopefully kind of a simple one, just thinking about who's listening and, okay, this has all been really interesting, perhaps they're inspired to do something about this. Just kind of reflecting on what piece of advice would you give someone, who might be able to go and do something tomorrow, for instance, to perhaps start thinking about this. So if it might be an example of, well, definitely avoid doing this. This is a really bad example of community engagement. It could be, this is a really great example of how to do community engagement, go and find out more about this. Or it could be something completely different. And I think particularly at the moment, a few people have mentioned, you know, with the coronavirus pandemic, you know, how do you engage communities remotely, perhaps when you can't go and visit them face to face? Sorry, that's quite a lot to cover, but I'm going to give you 1 minute to provide your support, your response. Sorry. So I'm going to free for all. Does anyone want to answer that first? This is the awkward moment, isn't it, when we have
I'm happy to go first.
Great,
So.
thanks,
So I think a big no-no for me would be telling people what's happening. A big thumbs up would be ask questions, you know, keep it open for discussion, let people realise that nothing's set in stone. We are right at the start of a lengthy process potentially, and that, not that there's everything to play for, but certainly, you know, open discussion is very much welcome. They are very much part of the project is for them. Sorry, what was the last thing you said? What was it?
if there's anything particular about the current time with the coronavirus pandemic? And
yeah, again, sorry, yeah. So again, the lowly letter comes back into play. Emails, posters, newspapers, anything you can just put out there into the public arena that can be digested and still allows access and open discussion. Absolutely, there's lots of, and now obviously with Teams and Zoom and Google, and we have a myriad of ways of talking about these projects as we go forward.
Nice, thank you, Jenny. Frank or Simon, who wants to take the next lot? Frank, looks like you.
Yeah. Well, I think from my side, I think one is being aware that it's a lengthy process and it takes time to build that trust. But then again, also, you need to sort of create that narrative so that when you're doing the first engagement, you sort of feedback to them during the next one, what came out of the first one, and there's a continuous story or a continuous conversation so that everyone is looped in. Because then you have instances of people coming in later and asking the same questions. So you want to be able to feedback. I think the other one is being able to also map out who is attending and recognizing what cultural and power dynamics exist in the group that you have participating. And I think, well, the other thing is transparency, really. Like, if you have to be really transparent with them about the timeline of the project, the scope of the project, and so that they're able to, you know, be in the same page and you don't look like you're being, you have to look transparency, and then you get back the same thing back from them. The additional one on COVID, I think from our side, is finding a way to sort of compensate people coming for such, I think, conversations, and also looking at when it's convenient for them to be able to attend as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Frank. And then finally, Simon, how would you answer that question?
Sure. So I think just in terms of sort of pointers, I guess I would love to point people towards this. And I was actually engaging with someone called Joseph on the Q&A about this concept of co-creation and co-design. And Jenny, I'd like to kind of challenge you to look at the co-design and co-creation possibilities, even despite the procurement issues. And often what we find is that better results come from getting local input into a product that is otherwise assumed to be the standard or the best, because of the way that local conditions, even in different kind of climatic conditions of the UK or whatever, can actually cause for a product to be improved using that local input. Or, you know, and there's so many different dynamics. And I really like this idea of co-creation, as long as it is not co-opted, and it just becomes another term that is introduced, but the practice does not change. And I think that, you know, I just Googled like co-creation engineering, and you can find a bunch of different resources available to see how to introduce co-production or co-creation principles within your specific sector, which I would love to promote that. And I think the real challenge there is to actually take that from, to give that teeth, to give the concept teeth, to be able to, for instance, in budgeting or planning or procurement processes, to really have the service provider carry it out in a way that's not just for, you know, not just a nod to the term.
Yeah, great. Thank you all. I'm really sorry we're going to have to end it there because I'm 2 minutes over time. So I apologise to everyone for sneaking into just beyond midday. I think if I can just summarise what the three of you just said, you know, real emphasis there on learning. You know, there's plenty of resources out there to find out more about this, continue to educate yourself. Real emphasis there on listening. So active listening, you know, engaging community is all about building that trust, as Frank touched on a number of times. And the first part of that is really actively listening to people, hearing their voices, not trying to influence them with your own opinions. And as Frank said, you know, providing that feedback that you have listened, this is what you said, this is what we heard, this is now what we're doing with it. So I really like all three of your responses. I like the additional little cheeky extra challenge that Simon set for Jenny there. And thank you everybody who's been listening. It's been such an interesting topic, and I know we could have spent hours discussing it. I know there's lots of questions that we haven't been able to answer during this session. We're sorry we haven't been able to get to them, but it's great to see that everyone was engaging and really thinking deeply on this topic. So thank you, Jenny, Simon and Franklin, for your being our amazing panelists today. I'm gonna virtually applaud you from my living room. And thanks everyone for tuning in, listening and submitting your questions. So we'd love for you to take what you've heard today further, challenge yourselves to be the person perhaps consistently in the room asking, are we including all the right voices, and how can we better engineer for people and with people, and really building on this idea of co-design and co-creation that Simon's mentioned there. So after this, you should all be receiving an email with details of our next panel discussion. So that will be on the 13th of August. And we're going to be exploring how the lack of diversity is being tackled in the engineering sector, both in terms of the systemic changes that are needed, but also how every individual has a part to play. We'd also like to ask you for a bit of feedback. This is our first virtual panel discussion we've hosted, so we'd really appreciate some improvement points. We're actively listening, so then hopefully we can play back how we've listened, what we've learned, and what we've put into practice. So have a great rest of your day. Obviously, please stay safe, and do let us know if you change how you engage communities in your engineering practice as part of what you've heard today. So thank you very much, and goodbye.